I'm doing that to sort of cut down on the distractions. But hopefully in a minute, you'll be able to see my screen as well. So, but still, hear me. So I'm just going to switch over now. And if I can just check, colleagues, that you can see, hopefully, a presentation in front of you with my name on. Then let's start. So colleagues, this afternoon, I'm going to explore some of the key messages from the English subject report and tie this into our Strong Foundations report that we published in October last year. I'm going to focus on a few themes in particular, as these might be the most helpful to you when looking to improve the impact of your English curriculum for your pupils. So, first of all, we're going to take a look at the research about high-quality early education. Because as well as our English research, Ofsted has also undertaken research in line with our strategic priority of giving children the best start in life. Previous research about what strong practice looks like in a reception class was found in our Bold Beginnings research. Our Best Start in Life research considers what works well for children from birth to 4 years old. We published part 3, which focuses on the specific areas of learning, in October 2024. And finally, our research into reception in Key Stage 1, Strong Foundations for the First Years of School, was also released in October. And I've used our findings from this recent research to inform what we're going to talk about in this session. A wide range of research is clear that high-quality early education establishes the foundations for later success, including academic achievement, good health, and well-being. Not only does high-quality early education benefit all children, but it's especially beneficial for those whose early education has been limited. Ofsted's subject reports show some notable improvements in primary schools over recent years. I'm going to take an extract from that now. Our report says that the teaching of reading has improved markedly. An increased emphasis on reading, for example, through government policy, the work of English hubs such as yours, and Ofsted's focus on how well schools teach pupils to read, has helped leaders to understand the importance of teaching systematic synthetic phonics. And compared with our findings in previous reports, this represents an overwhelmingly positive shift towards having all children reading by the end of Key Stage 1. Schools have invested in phonics programs and training so that teachers know how to teach pupils to read. For example, systematic synthetic phonics programs are now widely used. Phonics teaching begins at the start of reception, and pupils practice reading books matched to the sounds they know. So that's in our English report. However, the positives are not as evident for disadvantaged pupils. Around 3 in 10 cannot decode sufficiently well by the end of year 1. We know that if these gaps are not closed in the early years, they tend to widen. And once pupils fall behind, it's hard for them to catch up. And as our Chief Inspector, Sir Martin Oliver, has said, if we get it right for the most vulnerable pupils, we get it right for everyone. In the Strong Foundations report and in this session today, it's these pupils who will be at the front of our minds. Hopefully, we can shed some light on the practices we see which are likely to be most helpful or unhelpful, with the aim of supporting schools in placing their attention where it's likely to have the most positive impact. So, given the importance of making sure that all children have the best start in life and securing critical foundational knowledge by the end of Key Stage 1 being vital to that, we were particularly interested to find out why some children struggle to learn the knowledge that their peers secure much more quickly. What could we learn from the most effective practice that would help all children learn what they need? And that's what I want to highlight today, because that's what's shared in more detail in the Strong Foundations report. So let's first think about what happens when children don't learn the important foundational knowledge that they need. And I'm going to tell you a story now, the story of Jo. As you learn about her journey, think about what could have worked better for Jo at each point in her education. When Jo is 3, she goes to nursery at school for 2 sessions per week. She doesn't seem to say as much as the other children. Adults say that in the limited time that they have to play with her, their priority is socialisation. So they're happy just to let her play. Jo chooses to play with only some of the activities on offer. She plays in the sandpit, in the home corner, and with the train track. She flits between areas and usually plays alone. Jo can't express her wants or needs very well, but she doesn't disrupt anyone else, so no one really notices. Jo is 5 now and learning phonics. She knows the routines well and always sits in the right place. When her teacher asks the children to say the sound for the grapheme shown, Jo answers just a few seconds after everyone else. She knows what to say because she copies the other children. Jo finds lower key stage 2 hard. Her teacher blames the year 3 gap. She didn't meet the expected standard in reading or mathematics at the end of Key Stage 1, so a teaching assistant keeps an eye on her and writes down all the words that Jo can't spell, reads the worksheets to her, and makes sure that she can complete the maths work. And Jo's happy as long as the TA is there to tell her what to do. Let's think of Jo when she's 11 and about to leave primary school. She is really worried about going to secondary school because she won't be with her friend Kim, who always helps her with the answers to questions. Jo likes the class routines because she can always phone a friend if she's asked anything. Her teacher says that really helps her. Now we're thinking about Jo in Key Stage 3. Here the story changes again, because Jo finds the transition really difficult. And she doesn't like the English lesson that she has on a Thursday afternoon when she has PE as well. And that's the afternoon that she tends to miss. After lunch, there's always drop everything and read time. Jo has been reading the same graphic novel for the last 3 months. And Jo doesn't get into any trouble at the end of Key Stage 4 because she doesn't attend school very much. When she does go to school, she spends a lot of time in the nook, lying on the beanbags. The head of inclusion's trying to organise some equine therapy for her to build her confidence. And when Jo leaves school, she doesn't have any GCSEs, and she finds it difficult to read, but she doesn't want to tell anyone. This makes it hard to find a job. So let's just reflect for a minute. What could have worked better for Jo at each point of her education? Now, when thinking about this, I'm going to take you back to our Strong Foundations research, and that identified 3 main findings. And here's the first. In the strongest examples, schools not only shared a determination that all children would gain the knowledge that they needed, but they had made that possible by clearly identifying what children needed to know each step of the way and checking that children had learned and remembered it. However, some schools were not as explicit in identifying the important knowledge that all pupils needed. This meant that teachers did not know what to prioritise in teaching and assessment. And when securing important knowledge was left too much to chance, not enough children were well prepared to access the curriculum at Key Stage 2. Some curriculums were overloaded with activities that didn't help children to build fluency in foundational knowledge and skills. And this left too little time for children to practice what they'd been taught until they could remember it automatically. Most schools are clear that certain teaching, such as learning to read and write and understand and use numbers, cannot be left to chance through a child's own choices. However, when the reception curriculum is not clear enough about what all children need to learn, it can become merely a list of activities. Simply providing activities that children can choose from is not enough. Where there's a choice about whether to take part, some children, and often those who needed the most teaching and practice, are able to opt out and therefore not learn what they need. And this exacerbates their disadvantage. This vulnerable minority of children are more likely to suffer when opportunities to learn are not equitable. Adults tend not to interact with them as much as they do with other children. This hinders important language development. These children are likely to need more teaching and practice opportunities than their peers. Some classroom organisation, for example, expecting children who are already behind to attempt tasks which are well beyond their competence, results in them wasting time guessing and struggling, or being overly supported and told the answers, rather than using that time to teach the knowledge that they need to be successful and learn what their peers already know. For example, the children in reception year are often asked to write stories or about recent events before they've learned the necessary knowledge and skills. And this is particularly difficult for children with lower starting points. For example, all the children in a Year 1 class might be expected to write a character description, even though some of them still cannot form all their letters or have the phonics knowledge that they need to spell the words. As a result, the gap between them and their peers widens. And our third main finding is the one on the screen now, that schools' curriculums for English and literacy in the early years, beyond the teaching of phonics, are often weak. Now, we know that the teaching of reading is improving. As I said earlier, government policy and guidance and research on how well schools teach children to read have all highlighted the role of systematic synthetic phonics. Practice has improved. Staff have received high-quality training and children get plenty of chances to rehearse and embed what they're learning. Other areas of the English or literacy curriculum, such as spoken language and transcription, often lack this rigour. Schools sometimes introduce complex reading and writing tasks too early. They don't give children enough teaching and practice for them to become fluent in foundational knowledge and skills, such as in handwriting and composing simple sentences. And as we heard in the previous finding, this particularly affects lower attaining children. We saw that end of Key Stage 1 assessments can unhelpfully influence schools' decisions about the English curriculum. These assessments are no longer statutory. However, many schools still provide children with complex reading and writing tasks that replicate those tests well before they've taught them what they need to know to complete them successfully. Now, we'll look at what we know from our research and inspection work about a high-quality English curriculum. And we're going to start with spoken language, or communication and language as it's referred to in the early years foundation stage. And our English report found that the curriculum for spoken language tends to be considered in far less detail than the curriculum for reading and writing. Teachers often attribute pupils' weakness in speaking to a lack of confidence, rather than realising that they haven't been taught what they need to know about the topic under discussion to be able to form and articulate worthwhile contributions. It can be seen just as a pedagogy rather than being the object of study in itself. And we'll come back to the importance of spoken language when we look at writing later in the session. Now, developing children's vocabulary explicitly, especially in the early years, is a critical part of the English curriculum. Without action to tackle it, the word gap grows. This has been called the Matthew effect, that is, the word rich get richer and the word poor get poorer. If schools work to reduce the word gap in the early years and Key Stage 1 well, then disadvantaged children can develop their vocabulary faster. Communication and language are even more of a priority because of the impact of COVID-19. The quality and quantity of interactions between adults and children should extend children's vocabulary and their use of spoken language. Children should be exposed to a wide range of books which support their understanding of the world and broaden and deepen their vocabularies. So it's a question of planning that curriculum really carefully, making those choices of text really deliberately to address those priorities. And finally, very importantly, all children need to benefit, not just those who arrive with more confidence. And let's think about each of those ways to develop children's communication and language. First of all, those high-quality interactions. Frequent, high-quality interactions between children and practitioners play a fundamental role in building the knowledge and skills that children will need. High-quality interactions are more likely to take place when adults notice what children know and can do and respond accordingly. Their responses are based on what they know about each child and their wider understanding of child development. Adults know the curriculum in advance. Interactions are more effective when staff know what they want children to learn, and then they can intentionally introduce new words, the vocabulary that will help children describe their thoughts and feelings and understand the world around them. Now, this isn't about learning long lists of words, but what we're saying is knowing the curriculum helps everybody working with those children identify the words and concepts that will be really helpful to those children for current and future learning. All children experience enough planned and incidental interactions with adults to learn what they need. Now, some children will need within that more targeted time and attention than others. And sharing books and reading aloud to children is also really important. Listening and discussing books gives pupils an understanding of language. It helps to give them the knowledge that they need to understand what they read once they're reading accurately and speedily. And we know that pupils will come across a more broad and rich vocabulary in books than they will hear in everyday conversation. And there should be lots of repetition in the early stages. Research shows that small group reading is especially beneficial to children with lower levels of language. And our English report found that most schools prioritise time for pupils to read and talk about books. Story time is a regular feature of reception and Key Stage 1 classrooms. However, in other key stages, even when timetabled, reading does not happen as often as is intended. And we know that reading is important foundational knowledge. Reading is the gateway to learning across the curriculum. And as we've heard in one of the main findings, the teaching of reading has markedly improved in primary schools over the last few years. But there's still more to do, particularly for the lowest attaining children, many of whom may also be disadvantaged or have SEND. And I know that many of you will be familiar with Goff and Tumner's simple view of reading. Let's just remind ourselves of what this diagram tells us, and shortly we'll be using it to see the parallels with writing. Now, this model shows that there are two elements to being able to read: word reading and language comprehension. And pupils need to develop both language comprehension and word reading if they are to read with comprehension and get into that top right quadrant. So reading with comprehension is the product of both. Neither is sufficient on its own. And in the most effective schools, we see each element taught separately in the early stages. So word reading accuracy taught through phonics, and language comprehension gained through those frequent, high-quality interactions that I talked about, being read to, discussing a wide range of books, as well as the language knowledge that's gained from studying a broad curriculum. But in some schools, there's a rush to having a whole school approach to reading comprehension. This approach often replicates the end of key stage assessments for Year 6 and the now non-statutory Year 2 tests. This might not always be appropriate for pupils whose word reading knowledge is not developed well enough for them to benefit from this. Through the teaching of phonics, pupils become fluent decoders. Let's think about how. So, pupils will not pick up phonics through discovery, like playing with letters in the sand. They need instruction, and they get that in phonics teaching. And we also know that pupils need planned opportunities for them to practice what they've been taught so that it becomes secure and embedded. Now, that might be as part of a longer phonics session. It might be in other times in that day. But these are some of the examples that you'll see. So you'll see on the bullets daily instruction and planned opportunities to practice. They might practice that through reading books that are really well matched to the sounds that they know, and through rereading those books. So they build that bank of words and become fluent and automatic in their reading. And building fluency as part of a systematic synthetic phonics program is usually well understood in schools. Less so is how pupils continue to build their fluency beyond phonics. As you'll know, meeting the standard in the phonics screening check does not mean a pupil is a fluent reader. They may be able to decode words accurately, but not speedily enough to make sense of what they're reading. And the checks focused on decoding accuracy and not automaticity. Fluency relies on both accuracy and automaticity, and the check does not check this. So, what might the teaching of reading look like after phonics? Beyond phonics and into Key Stage 2, pupils need to get sufficient practice to become fluent readers. It needs to be the right type of practice, depending on pupils' existing knowledge and skills. Some schools are effective in continuing to develop pupils' reading fluency once they can decode. They provide pupils with lots of opportunities to read aloud and be read to, so that they learn how to control the pace and intonation in their reading. They encourage pupils to read a wide range of books once they're fluent readers, and so build a reading habit and increase those reading miles. Now, let's have a think about an example of what sometimes happens when there's a rush to a whole school approach for reading comprehension. Let's imagine that schools recently introduced a whole school approach to teaching reading comprehension. This starts at Year 1, and each group in the class have the same book about hedgehogs. And today, the teacher's working with the yellow group. Now, the children in this group can't read the book, so the teacher reads it for them. They then have to answer the questions on the worksheet and record those answers in their book. But the children can't read the questions, so the teacher reads the worksheet to them and asks them if they can remember what the text has said to help them answer the questions. If the children can't remember the answers, the teacher tells them or writes it down for them to copy in their books. The children not only find it difficult to remember some of the answers to the questions, but actually they struggle to form some of the letters and spell many of the words that they're trying to write. However, the school leaders looking on believe that this is really inclusive practice because this group are accessing age-appropriate texts just like their peers. Now, our evidence shows that actually this sort of experience for the lowest attaining children in Key Stage 1 is not unusual. Pupils are being asked to complete a complex task before they have secured the knowledge to be able to do this. This wastes valuable time that could be better spent teaching or practicing important foundational knowledge to learn what their peers already know. So, what might the teaching of reading look like after phonics? Well, beyond phonics and into Key Stage 2, pupils need to get sufficient practice to become fluent readers. But it needs to be the right type of practice, dependent on pupils' existing knowledge and skills. And some schools are effective in continuing to develop pupils' reading fluency once they can decode. They provide pupils with lots of opportunities to read aloud and be read to, so that they learn how to control the pace and intonation in their reading. They encourage pupils to read a wide range of books once they're fluent readers. We know as well that sometimes there can be confusion about the purpose of reading lessons. And that's because different parts of the same lesson have different aims. If we go back to the simple view of reading, this can help us. We need to be really clear that when the aim is to develop fluency, it needs to be the pupils doing the reading, and they need to be reading books that are decodable for them. However, if the purpose was about language comprehension, then the adult is likely to be doing the reading. All pupils could access this part of the lesson as set out in the national curriculum, age-appropriate access to the texts that are read to them and discussed. To go back to our example before, expecting children to answer written comprehension questions when they can't read the text on their own or write down the answers is not realistic. They need more practice in reading those decodable books and developing reading fluency as well. And actually, that's what the national curriculum says too. For pupils who don't have the phonic knowledge and skills that they need, teachers should use the previous year group's programme of study for word reading and spelling so that pupils' word reading skills catch up. However, teachers should use age-appropriate programmes of study for comprehension so that these pupils hear and talk about new books, poems, other writing and vocabulary with the rest of the class. And our English Research Review highlights the limits of teaching reading comprehension strategies. Reading comprehension instruction can be beneficial when it's brief and explicit. And evidence shows that a total of 10 to 15 lessons of instruction is sufficient. But beyond some time-limited instruction and practice, comprehension strategies are unlikely to be useful as a continued learning objectives for pupils. And as we've said, pupils must be able to decode fluently before those strategies can be effective. Comprehension strategies are not skills that can be honed through repeated practice regardless of the context. Rather, they are useful metacognitive strategies that will be applied successfully if pupils have enough relevant knowledge of the text to do so. A finding in research that's been repeated many times is that when readers considered weak read a passage about something that they know a lot about, for example, football, they have higher comprehension than readers generally considered strong, but with a limited knowledge of football. So, what are we doing when we're teaching reading comprehension strategies? Is that we're helping pupils know what to think about when they're trying to understand a text. For example, knowing to check that they understand what's read, relating sentences to one another, and making links to what they already know. Crucially, it doesn't provide the knowledge that they already need. So for that reason, these are the features our research review identified as being an effective reading curriculum. A successful reading comprehension requires fluent reading and an understanding of the language read, like we saw in the simple view of reading. And then an effective reading curriculum focuses on providing pupils with the knowledge they need for comprehension, not generic comprehension skills, and develops fluency by ensuring that pupils read large amounts of text. A reading curriculum is supported by the careful choice of increasingly challenging texts. And these principles will be important to consider when designing or making improvements to your English curriculum. And there are many successful ways for schools to achieve this. So, moving on to writing now. Let's remind ourselves of what the national curriculum says. Take a moment to have a read. So the primary curriculum does not require pupils to be taught any particular genres or text types. While a particular text type may be a useful context or a purpose for writing, it can take the focus away from developing essential transcription knowledge, such as spelling and handwriting, or compositional knowledge, such as composing a sentence orally before writing it. But it does specify that pupils have to write for a range of contexts, purposes, and audiences. An effective writing curriculum will give pupils opportunities to develop their proficiency in two interrelated areas of writing set out in the national curriculum: transcription and composition. We often find on inspection a lack of separate attention to transcription and composition to really secure the knowledge and to gain fluency with handwriting and spelling. And if we don't do this, then pupils struggle to do what that first bullet says, to write clearly and accurately and coherently. Using the simple view of reading, but applying it to writing, helps us to see the similarities between reading and writing. The axes in this case reflect both the national curriculum for writing and the early years foundation stage educational programme for literacy, composition and transcription. I'll pause for a minute to let you look at the slide. And what we see from the most successful schools is that just like reading, these two elements benefit from being taught separately in the early stages. Fluency in transcription frees up working memory to focus on composing writing. Before pupils can put their ideas in a written form, they need to have ideas, the words, and be able to say what it is they want to write, either aloud or silently. That's oral composition, which relies on pupils' language comprehension. Once pupils have the necessary transcriptional knowledge and skills, using their phonics knowledge for spelling and knowing how to form letters accurately, then they can focus on communicating their ideas in a written form, so that top right-hand quadrant. So, just as fluent word reading is essential to reading with comprehension, the same goes for transcription fluency with children's writing composition. Our English report and our Strong Foundations report found that the most successful schools give children plenty of teaching and practice to gain high degrees of fluency in transcription, spelling and handwriting. In contrast, when children struggle to gain transcription fluency, we found that our lowest attaining children in a class were expected to carry out independent writing tasks well before they had the required knowledge and skills. When children are asked to write a lot of words that they don't know how to spell or don't know how to form the letters accurately, it's like giving them a book with lots of words in it that they can't read. They have to resort to guessing, and they waste time doing that rather than practicing the knowledge they need that would help them to write fluently. These sort of practices confuse children, making it more difficult than necessary for them to learn, or it discourages them. So, how do pupils become automatic with transcription? Well, just like phonics, they won't pick up transcription, that is, spelling or letter formation, through discovery. They need instruction. And again, this often comes through phonics teaching. Once taught, pupils need good quality planned opportunities for them to practice what they've been taught so that it becomes secure and embedded. And the national curriculum, as we can see here, for Year 1 to Year 4, includes references to dictation. Writing simple dictated sentences that include words taught so far gives children opportunities to practice and apply their spelling without their having to think about what it is they want to say. Children's writing generally develops at a slower pace than their reading. Before they can write independently in a way that can be read by others, they need to know what it is they want to say, how to identify the sounds in words, at least one way to spell each of the sounds in English, and how to form letters. And in the most effective schools visited as part of our research, when transcription fluency was the teaching aim, we saw pupils practicing what they'd been taught with spelling and letter formation through dictation. So, we can think of dictation as the writing equivalent of decodable books. Just as decodable books isolate the knowledge that's been taught, allowing it to be practiced, in the same way, dictation is a way to make sure that children accurately spell every word and form every letter as they have already been taught the knowledge that's needed. If children have not developed sufficient fluency in transcription, it will be hard for them to compose a piece of writing independently. Not all children will have the spelling and handwriting skills that they need to write down everything that they can compose out loud. So, activities should set children up for success. However, it is still common practice in some schools, including for children as young as reception, to be asked to compose writing before they have the transcription knowledge to be successful. But with plenty of practice in writing from dictation, children will find it easier to write independently. Just like with reading, some whole school approaches to writing are not realistic for children in the early stages of learning to write. For example, in some schools, the writing curriculum is based on producing different text types, such as instructions, recounts, and stories. When schools focus on text types in reception and Key Stage 1, they often pay less attention to foundational knowledge such as spelling, handwriting, and orally composing sentences, which would allow children to successfully compose such pieces of extended writing. Let's look at an example of how dictation might be used. If we imagine that the reception teacher wants children to write a shopping list, rather than asking the children to think of the items themselves, the teacher could make that decision and dictate the words based on the children's current transcription knowledge and skills. So, given the stage in the year, close to October half term, then children are likely to be able to write the word ham. But at that point, they probably won't have the phonic knowledge to spell words like chips or grapes, which contain consonant and vowel digraphs that won't have been taught yet. So, dictation also helps teachers to tailor transcription practice to what different groups of children know. And of course, if ham is the only shopping list item that the teacher can think of that children will know how to spell, then writing a shopping list is probably not the most useful activity. The purpose is to develop children's transcription fluency. However, if the purpose was about being able to name food items, then perhaps this activity could be done orally and children's transcription could be practiced through a different task. So what does the national curriculum in Year 1 say about handwriting? It's worth reminding ourselves of the content of the national curriculum, as we often find that some parts are given less attention than others. When is pen grip taught? When are letter families taught? When are capital letters taught? And when are forming the digits 0 to 9 taught? If phonics lessons are the only time that pupils are taught handwriting, then actually some of these expectations can be missed. And ultimately, have pupils had sufficient practice of all of this to be fluent so that they don't embed errors? The most successful schools taught the two distinct parts of writing, oral composition and transcription, separately in the early stages. And that dictation practice continued until pupils were fluent, whatever their age. This made sure that pupils gained the knowledge that they needed to complete the complex extended writing tasks like writing a story or a recount. With plenty of practice in writing from dictation, children found it easier to write independently. Now, you might be wondering, what does that mean for children that choose to write something independently? Now, direct instruction of transcription and oral comprehension does not stop those children who can already write from choosing to do so independently, or curb the enthusiasm of those children who choose to mark make as they play. But what's really important is getting all children off the starting blocks so that they all have the knowledge needed to be successful with writing. And so it's important to make the best use of the time when they are with an adult to do just that. The message about teaching the different parts of writing separately in the early stages also has implications for every subject where children are asked to write. Writing in books, in science or history, or in any other subject should consider children's transcription knowledge and carefully dictated words and sentences matched to children's transcription knowledge. That might be helpful for some children if they don't have the knowledge needed to write independently. Effective support for disadvantaged children and those with SEND has always been important in reception in Key Stage 1. And since the pandemic, it has become even more important. Children who fall behind early on struggle to catch up. And children are likely to progress at different rates and therefore may need different quantities and kinds of teaching to succeed. So we need to continue to ensure that pupils in reception and Key Stage 1 have daily phonics teaching until they're accurate in word reading, that is decoding. This includes identifying pupils who are beginning to fall behind and giving them extra practice. And we need to make sure that staff know how to continue to develop pupils' reading fluency once they're able to decode accurately, which, for the majority, will happen at the end of the phonics programme. And we also need to make sure that all Key Stage 2 staff are trained in systematic synthetic phonics and so can reinforce pupils' word reading and transcription skills in Key Stage 2 reading and English lessons. And given the reversible nature of the phonics code, if pupils struggle with reading, then they are also likely to struggle with writing. Now, on inspection, we're often asked questions about pupils with SEND in relation to phonics. So we've put together some key points as a reminder. All pupils need the same knowledge of the alphabetic code for independent reading and spelling. Extensive research, which underpins Ofsted's education inspection framework and the national curriculum, points to the importance of teaching phonics until children can decode automatically. And our evaluation criteria reflects this research. Understanding the alphabetic code, that the letters on the page represent the sounds in spoken words, is the basis of successful word reading. Therefore, phonics represents the body of knowledge needed for word reading and spelling, and is not a pedagogy. Without this knowledge, pupils will not have the means to read unfamiliar words, and that's true for all pupils who are learning to read, including those with SEND. Broadly speaking, it will be only those pupils with severe cognitive difficulties that do not reach the point of learning to read. Crucially, they'll be on the same curriculum journey as their peers, but at a much earlier stage. Wherever possible, leaders should be ambitious about pupils learning to read, given its impact on future success and well-being. Under the Equality Act of 2010, there's a requirement to make reasonable adjustments to enable pupils with disabilities to have full access to the curriculum and be able to participate in it, and that includes phonics. Any attempt at a different curriculum, such as teaching pupils to read whole words by sight, will not provide a long-term strategy for decoding unfamiliar words. Teaching sight words alongside phonics is confusing to pupils, as it leaves them unclear about which strategy to apply, often resulting to guessing. Additionally, if pupils are able to learn to recognise a word by sight, then they're able to learn to recognise a grapheme phoneme cluster. And it's sometimes assumed that if pupils are struggling with reading, then the phonics hasn't worked and they must need something different. And the problem is too often seen as being with the child rather than a knowledge deficit. Now, it's likely that some pupils with SEND will need more practice to secure important phonic knowledge. But that doesn't mean that phonics doesn't work, or that other strategies should be used instead or alongside. Assessment should identify the precise knowledge which pupils are struggling with so that teaching can be targeted accordingly. And for pupils with SEND, teachers might like to think differently about pedagogy choices. For example, pupils are likely to benefit from being in a small group, free from distractions, and with learning broken down into smaller steps, increased repetition and overlearning. Older pupils may need more age-appropriate resources. The curriculum doesn't change, but the activities and the resources, those pedagogical choices, might. And with fluency, whether that's with word reading, handwriting, or spelling, it's helpful to think about going as fast as possible, but as slow as necessary. Children can't just leapfrog through the curriculum, moving to more complex tasks which may well be age appropriate, in the hope that those who are struggling will just work it out and catch up. Some children in a class will need teaching from an earlier stage of the same curriculum. They need to learn the same knowledge as their peers that their peers already have. We know research says that there are times when differentiation can be unhelpful. But regarding fluency in foundational knowledge, it's absolutely necessary. Now, the message on the slide in front of you sometimes challenges people's thinking about inclusion. Our subject reports and strong foundations report found that lots of schools were doing things because they felt it was inclusive, but actually were failing to address what those pupils needed most urgently to learn. For example, classroom practice, such as adults overly supporting them through activities by telling them the answers or giving them sentences to copy, wastes valuable learning time. Supporting children in these ways shows that the task is too complex and that time will be better spent on teaching or practicing the knowledge that would allow them ultimately to be successful with such a task. The best way to make pupils feel included is to give them the knowledge that their peers already have. So you can see in front of you some of the features of a high quality English curriculum. I'll pause a minute to give you the time to read it. And here are some important considerations. I'll pause again. So, to finish off the session before we reach the time for questions, let's look at these 4 themes which pull together our findings and the messages that I've shared today. Although I've focused on English today, actually, these principles can be applied across the curriculum. Firstly, the importance of a curriculum which sets out clearly the small steps which children need to learn at each stage, and ensuring that children are given enough teaching and practice to become fluent in these. These are fundamentals which explain the strengths we typically see in early reading. However, as we've noted, this was often weaker in English and literacy curriculums beyond phonics. Often curriculums tended to introduce complex reading and writing tasks too early, and there was not enough emphasis on teaching and practicing some foundational knowledge, such as how to compose simple sentences orally, how to hold a pencil correctly and accurately form letters and numbers, and how to spell. In some examples, we saw a lack of awareness of the national curriculum requirements for handwriting in Key Stage 1. For example, some schools only taught handwriting in phonics lessons, and that meant elements of the handwriting programs of study, such as number formation and teaching letter formation through families of letters which are formed in similar ways, were not part of the curriculum. In the most effective schools, enough time was given to providing the teaching and the practice needed to make sure that all children had the important knowledge to fluency. These schools accepted that some children would need more practice than others and prioritised this when deciding how to organise their teaching. They knew that rushing through the curriculum and expecting children to do too much too soon may give the illusion of progress, but that it creates gaps in children's knowledge that will take more time to deal with later. It might be helpful, when considering practice, to keep in mind the phrase, practice makes permanent. While we might be more familiar with the phrase practice makes perfect, if children are practicing incorrectly, then they embed errors, and this can result in habits that are difficult to break at a later stage. We sometimes see the impact of this with children in Key Stage 2 who have an unhelpful pen grip or incorrect letter formation, for example. And to illustrate these points, if the teacher wants children to be able to retell a story by the end of the week, it's important to identify which small steps will need to be taught, checked, and practiced along the way to help every child reach that end point. If the task is not broken down into smaller steps, it can be left to chance whether a child succeeds or not. Once small steps of knowledge are clear, it's important to provide the right amount of teaching and practice for them to become secure. Some children will need more teaching and practice than others. For example, if a group of children are struggling to name all of the characters in the story they're going to be retelling at the end of the week, then it tells the teacher that they still need to become more familiar with the story and might need adults to read it to them a few more times in a smaller group, along with the regular checks on whether they can name the characters and describe the beginning, middle, and end. Our second key principle: language is key. Our report underlines the value of stories, rhymes, and songs, including repeating and revisiting these. But we also found that opportunities to develop spoken language were not always maximised. In order to write, children needed to be able to prepare their ideas and compose them orally, that is, to say out loud what it is they want to write. In the rush to have work recorded in books, some schools missed out opportunities for discussions, composing sentences orally, retelling stories, reciting poems, and learning them off by heart for performance. So, a reminder that not everything needs to be recorded in books for it to be valuable. Now, we know that in some schools there are expectations about the amount of written recording in books. However, Ofsted does not have any set requirement for this. Reading is valuable in its own right, as is discussing what's been read. There does not need to be written proof that this has happened. Whole school policies about the frequency of work in books can be unrealistic for reception in Key Stage 1 classes, where spoken language needs to be prioritised, and not all children have the knowledge that they need to record their learning and writing. The development of spoken language rests on the quality and frequency of interactions with adults. And sometimes we saw adults giving more attention to the more confident and articulate children in the group. This promotes their intellectual and social development at the expense of the minority who need the most support. It is crucial that we pay particular attention to those who are most at risk of falling behind. The curriculum is also important here. In reception classrooms in particular, the most effective curriculums were clear about what all children should know, so it wasn't possible for some children to opt out of crucial learning. In these schools, they knew that simply providing experiences for children to choose from is not enough. Not all children take part fully in what's offered, and those with more limited knowledge are often the least likely to participate, which widens the gaps over time. And as we have discussed, some children will need more teaching or practice, and some may well need to be taught from an earlier stage in the curriculum. With fluency, whether that's with word reading, handwriting, spelling, or number facts, as we've heard, it's helpful to think about going as fast as possible, but as slow as necessary. Our subject reports and Strong Foundations report found lots of schools taking approaches which they felt were inclusive, but actually failed to address what some pupils most urgently needed to learn. For example, classroom practice such as adults overly supporting children through an activity by telling them the answers or giving them sentences to copy wastes valuable learning time. This means that the task is too complex, and that time will be better spent on teaching or practicing the knowledge which would allow them to be successful with such a task. The best way to make pupils feel included in the classroom is to give them the knowledge that their peers already have, and which will give them the best chance of learning the curriculum over time, not just completing a particular task in the moment. So, differentiation when it comes to fluency is essential. And the national curriculum provides some helpful reminders around this message. The Key Stage 1 national curriculum for maths, for example, says that while the expectation is that the majority of pupils will move through the programmes of study at broadly the same pace, decisions about when to progress should always be based on the security of pupils' understanding and their readiness to progress to the next stage. It goes on to say that those who are not sufficiently fluent with earlier material should consolidate their understanding, including through additional practice before moving on. And actually, the National Curriculum for English has a similar message. It says that for schools who do not have the phonic knowledge and skills that they need, teachers should use the programmes of study from earlier year groups for word reading and spelling to help them catch up. However, these pupils should hear and talk about the same texts as the rest of their class. And linked to this, our fourth principle is that some children are at different stages of the curriculum. Let's explore the differentiation issue a little further. Because all children need fluency with foundational knowledge and skills to make progress later, this means that for some of them, including children with SEND, may need to work at an earlier stage of the curriculum than their peers. This will enable them to learn and practice important knowledge that their peers already have until it's fluent. We often see children with insufficient knowledge being expected to attempt the same learning as their peers. Struggling to access the lesson wastes precious time and can threaten their self-confidence. Children who need more practice and teaching with their peers often end up with less. Schools may have children of different ages who are at the same stage of the curriculum journey with their fluency in word reading, transcription, or number facts. For example, Joel on the left, who is 5, is at an early stage of learning to write. And Anya, who's 7 on the right, may be at that same stage. And if neither of them know how to form letters correctly or spell simple words fluently, then this is what they now need to learn. Neither should be given more complex tasks before they have mastered this early knowledge. But Anya does need to learn this knowledge more urgently and is likely to need additional teaching and practice to make this happen. Stage is therefore likely to be more important than age when knowing what to teach, when it comes to knowledge that builds up step by step, like fluency in word reading, spelling, handwriting, and number facts. But there should also be an awareness of age so that we know how urgent it is that the knowledge becomes fluent. And just finally, before the end of the presentation, you'll be aware that we have a consultation going on currently. It affects all of the remits that you can see on the screen in front of you. With an idea that we are trying to develop a more collaborative and a transparent approach to inspection. Inspections that look and feel different, as our National Director says. So you might well have read about some of these changes, some of the things that in the proposals would stay the same, and some of the things that we're proposing to change as well. And what I'd really encourage you to do, if you haven't already done so, is to get involved and to take part through our consultation. You'll see on the consultation documents all kinds of information about what it is that we're proposing. There are questions to answer, there are textbooks, and as much or as little as you feel able to engage with, please do, and please give us your views. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm probably going to stop sharing my screen now and hand back to colleagues and see whether there are any questions that you'd like me to answer.